Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us tawfiq and istiqamah and ease of understanding and facility. الفاتحة على ما نوى أسلافنا الصالحين إلى حضرة سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا رسول الله محمد بن عبد الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وإلى روح الأئمة المجتهدين والعلماء العاملين وصوفية المحققين وأهل الذكر والتوحيد ومشايخ هذه الأمة بأن الله يتغشاهم بالرحمة والمغفرة ويعلي درجاتهم في الجنة وينفعنا بأسرارهم وأنوارهم وعلومهم ونفحاتهم في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين يا رب العالمين. Just a brief introduction to Professor Naqib Al-Atas' ideas, writings, method. As you well know, Professor Naqib Al-Atas was born in 1931 in Bogor. He comes from an aristocratic family. That means to say, if you study the history of Johor and its kingdom, you will find that in the early 20th century, say in the 1930s or 1920s, the Sultan of Johor was gifted with due to the relations between the Johorian kingdom and the Ottomans, with two ladies, yes, who were sisters, Khadijah Hanum and Ruqayyah Hanum. Of the one was married by the Sultan, the other was married to his brother. Yes, Ruqayyah was married to his brother. And when his brother passed away, this Ruqayyah Hanum, yes, she remained in the palace of Johor. At that time, the Mufti of Johor was Habib Salim bin Abdullah Al-Atas. And there was a great alim in Indonesia whose name was Abdullah bin Muhsin Al-Atas. Now when Abdullah bin Muhsin Al-Atas came to Johor, while the Sultan was away in Britain, yes, the Sultan was good friends with the Queen at that time, I think, or the royal family in Britain. So he spent a long time there. Enough time for Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin to marry this Ruqayyah Hanum. Yes. It was a short marriage. Yes, he married, had a son with her by the name of Ali. Yes, and then Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin, being a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knew that this is not going to bid very well with the Sultan. Yes, so they decided, due to the royal pressure and so on, to separate. So Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin went back to Bogor. But now Ruqayyah Hanum ended up becoming a very distinguished lady, because first she was married to brother to the Sultan, and from this first marriage came the family of Unku Aziz, yes, the royal professor, economist in Malaysia. The second marriage by Abdullah bin Muhsin gave birth to Ali. Ali, who would become the father of Professor Naqib Al-Atas, Professor Hussein Al-Atas, and their brother Dr. Zaid, who was an engineer, I think. And then after that, this Ruqayyah Hanum, after the Sultan came and realized, he got angry and everything, but by then a son was already born. Yes, ended up the Sultan was happy if Ruqayyah Hanum would marry the first chief minister of Johor, Datuk Jaafar. Yes, who would become the father of Datuk On. Yes, so from this single lady came the great stars of the Malay world. Yes, so On bin Jaafar. Therefore, Professor Naqib, growing up in his teenage years, he stayed in the house of On bin Jaafar. In his childhood, he was first brought up in the palace, but then during the Second World War, when the Japanese came, him and his elder brother Hussein was brought to Indonesia, to Jakarta. When they were brought to Jakarta, Hussein was a bit older than him, so by then he had finished certain level of education, so he was prepared and he was ready to be sent to the Netherlands. He would become a distinguished political scientist and a historian, as well as sociologist. So Hussein Al-Atas wrote The Myth of the Lazy Native, which is a very brilliant work, which prefigured some of the writings of Edward Said, who wrote on Orientalism. In fact, Edward Said actually cited Syed Hussein Alatas's Myth of the Lazy Native as a brilliant work of challenging the images that is projected by the colonizers about the Malay people. But Professor Naguib, when he went to Sukabumi, at first he went to a madrasah, madrasah Urwatul Wuthqa, run by somebody amongst the Ba'alawi from the Al-Kaf family. And during the holiday times, yes, when during the semester breaks, they will spend time in Bandung, yes, in the highlands of his mother's side, Baba Ragwan Al-Idrus, and the Idrusi side. Now his mother is also coming from a family of scholars. This Ragwan Al-Idrus is descended from Habib Muhammad Al-Idrus Sahib Surat, yes, yani a port in Gujarat in India, yes. And this Sahib Surat was a scholar who was also the teacher of Abu Hafs Umar bin Abdullah Bashaiban. And this Abu Hafs Umar bin Abdullah Bashaiban became the Sheikh of Sheikh Nuruddin Ar-Raniri, the greatest scholar of the Malay world in history. Yes. Now Nuruddin Ar-Raniri was, I'm giving you a bit of a history so that you know that Professor Naguib Alatas is not just an academician. That means to say there is this long, elaborate background in which he is deeply related, deeply connected to the intellectual as well as the spiritual tradition. So the line of the Aidarus, which Professor Naguib descended from, came from Habib Abu Bakar Adani, yes, Abu Bakar bin Abdullah Al-Adani, yes, the great wali of Adan. Nevertheless, from his father's side, he is the grandson of Abdullah bin Muhsin, who started Majlis Ta'alim An-Nur in Jakarta at that time. The great wali of Bogor, yes. His father was brought up in Johor, Habib Ali, but he was brought up in the way of the castle, in the way of the palace, not brought up in the traditional way. Some of our elders have, told us the story. One time when Habib Ali met his father, he realized his father was a great alim, wali. So he told his father, seeing how impressive it was, seeing people coming to the majlis and so on, asking for dua, barakah and so on. And he asked Abdullah bin Muhsin, can I become like you? He said, you cannot become like me. But maybe somebody from your children, like that. In fact, the name Professor Naguib Alatas was given by Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin himself. Yes, Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin died in 1932. Professor Naguib was born in 1931, next week, on the 5th of September. Yes. Baba Ragwan Al-Idrus was very close with her father-in-law, Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin. And this Habib Abdullah bin Muhsin, he left behind a collection of responses to questions pertaining to the Sharia, Fatawa, Haqa'iq, mainly the discussion of Haqa'iq and the science of Tasawwuf and realities. He had brilliant original commentaries on some aspects of the Sharhul Ainiyah. Yes, he was asked questions of that delicate nature in which he gave very pertinent answers. And if you see the work of Habib Zain, yes, this, I think, this collection of tafasir by the Sada Alawiyah, not the Manhajus Sawi, it's a small work, Fuyudat Ar-Rahmaniyah mungkin, Habib Zain. Yes, it's a collection of the tafasir of the Ba'alawis on certain verses in the Quran and certain hadith. And there you will find names such as Ali bin Muhammad al-Habshi, Imam Abdullah al-Haddad, but also you will find there, from this collection of answers of Abdullah bin Muhsin, Abdullah bin Muhsin's responses. And if you read deeply into the ideas of Professor Naguib Alatas, you will find also some of the statements in which Professor Naguib Alatas relates, writes and comments upon, especially in the Risalah untuk kaum Muslimin, for example. I know is derivative from the answers and responses of his grandfather. For example, in the Risalah untuk kaum Muslimin, Professor Alatas gave the meaning of that hadith, Al-Mu'min Mir'atul Mu'min. That means to say the believer is a mirror to another believer. According to Professor Nagib Alatas there, he says that the mu'min who is the mirror of the mu'min means the believer is the reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, Al-Mu'min. That means to say the reality of the mu'min is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the mu'min here, who is the mu'min in the sense of the believer, the one who has faith, the one who has iman, is a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's character and attribute. That is also from his grandfather, Abdullah bin Muhsin. Nevertheless, coming from this family, and in terms of the line between him and Professor Nagib and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he is number 37. So he is Muhammad An-Naqib bin Ali bin Abdullah bin Muhsin bin Muhammad, and a few more until Al-Qutub Al-Habib Umar bin Abdul Rahman Al-Attas, coming from Habib Umar bin Abdul Rahman Al-Attas' son Hussein, whose son is Muhsin. So he comes from Muhsin bin Hussein bin Umar bin Abdul Rahman Al-Attas. That's the line that he came from. And this family is also has significance in this part of the world also. Yes, because this Abdullah bin Muhsin, or Muhsin bin Muhammad, which was the Prophet Al-Attas' great-grandfather in this case, Muhsin bin Muhammad had special relations with Raja Ahmad of Riau. And this Raja Ahmad of Riau is the father of Raja Ali Haji. Yes, Raja Ali Haji, the great historian, political theorist, yes, the one who wrote the Bustanul Katibin, yes, elements of excellent writing, elements of, and who wrote, I think, one of the first dictionaries of technical terms in the Malay language, this Raja Ali Haji. A great scholar, Raja Ali Haji. So Raja Ali Haji's father had good relations with Habib Muhsin, to such an extent that it was chronicled in the Tuhfat An-Nafis. Tuhfat An-Nafis is a historical work, yes, written by Raja Ali Haji. There it is chronicled that during Hajj season in one of those years, Raja Haji Ahmad of Riau went to Makkah. During that time, Habib Muhammad, the father of Muhsin, or Habib Muhsin, the son of Muhammad Al-Attas, was resident in Makkah, and he had close relations with the Sharif of Makkah at that time, Sharif Yahya. So he told Sharif Yahya about his relations with this Raja Ahmad of Riau Lingga, to the extent that Sharif Yahya dispatched some of his guards, yes, to guard in front of the tent of Raja Ahmad, and also to put up fire for them and to assist them in any way possible. These are all history, yes. So that means to say, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to send for our people a scholar, he sends a very good one. Yes. This is Professor Nagib Al-Attas, who in himself combines so many traditions already. Just as I said just now, if you're paying attention, first there is the Ba'alawi line. Second, there is the Malay intellectual and spiritual tradition, the royal families. That means to say, and then from his father, the one who was brought up in the castle, after he completed his primary education at this Urwatul Wuthqa, he went back to Ngeheng in Johor, where he studied at the English College. During this period, when he was still a young teenager, his afternoons would be spent in his uncle's library. This was the time that in his afternoons he developed the ability to read manuscripts. Yes, he was reading the Malay manuscripts during this time, all the historical works. Hikayat Samudra Pasai, Hikayat Raja-Raja Siak, Sulalatu Salatin, all the works that were collected by his uncles. Why was he reading these hikayats? Why was he reading the historical works? What is its significance for his later future? Because when he reads this is to develop his linguistic and literary apparatus, to develop that stylistic ability to write. So jadi when he writes, especially when you read his Malay, it is literary and scientific at the same time. It is beautiful, yet precise. he has introduced a number of finesse in the form of writing, such that until today, the greatest users of the Malay language in our time, yeah, baik daripada Siddiq Fazil, Anwar Ibrahim, and a number of them of that generation, basically they got their style of Bahasa Melayu to Professor Nagib. And in reality, he was first a professor of Bahasa Melayu before he became Professor of Islamic Studies, despite his PhD being in philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. Yeah, philosophy, metaphysics, and theology, 3 in 1, his PhD. It was a study on Sheikh Hamzah Fansuri. And that study of Sheikh Hamzah Fansuri is not a mere translation. It was a study that involved historical work. It involves comparative philosophy, because if you read the mysticism of Hamzah Fansuri, you will find to your amazement that even in the methodology is another PhD for us to study. Because in the methodology, first he develops a study of language based on the summary of the best Western philosophy of language that was current in his time. So you see there in that short, not to say paragraph, footnote, yes? In that short footnote is an analysis spanning from the time of Ibn Rushd to Wittgenstein, who was near contemporaries with Professor Alatas, who had a theory of language. So he said, so he spent his youth reading literature of the Malay world. At the same time, when he was in Jakarta, in Indonesia, the Dutch at that time, remember Indonesia got their independence in 46. Jadi when he was there, the Dutch soldiers and the administrators, they were about to leave the country. So they left behind a lot of their books. So that's where he learned, and that's where he bought some great books of the Western tradition also. Yes. If you think about this is in 1940s, yes, when people amongst the Malay world did not develop this ability to read, isn't it? Not even the concern to read about the West. But here he was in his teens, yes. Aside from reading the literary works of the Malay world, he was also reading Western literature. He was reading the Norse sagas, the Icelandic sagas. You know, the Norse and the Icelandic sagas, meaning to say the mythologies of the Northern European peoples. He read about the Frankish people, about the Visigoths, about the Ostrogoths, about the Franks, about the Vandals, about the Lombards, all this, yes. The origins of the European peoples. So that's why he said, when he said intipati dan semangat ketamadunan barat itu, what he means by that is that he has been following these people in terms of their spirit and their soul from their early mythologies. He was reading Beowulf, Cinewulf, the Song of Roland, all these great literary things. In fact, some of the lines of Shakespeare he can still recite. When he was maybe in his 80s, he was still reciting from his mind the lines of Shakespeare. He memorized Shakespeare. At that time, when he was in his teens, of course, during this time, mathematics wasn't really his interest. Yes. Afwan, we take a bit more time so that we know who we are dealing with, inshallah, before we start on his book. One of his teachers, yeah, the one who teaches him mathematics, during the exam, he gave out an empty punya paper. So the teacher asked him, the teacher said, Said, if you don't do well in your mathematics exam, you will end up a gardener. You know what he said? The young man, he said, even if I end up a gardener, at least I will be a gardener who knows myself. Ada ma'rifah sudah, you know, at a young age, he has already ma'rifah. At 29, he published his first book of poetry, to the Rangkaian Rubaiyat. You read the Rangkaian Rubaiyat, you will think that maybe Jalaluddin Rumi wrote it. Maybe you wrote it. Yes, if you can find it, maybe in the library. It's a very old book, Rangkaian Rubaiyat. he writes Sufi poetry. Do you know who gave the preface? It was Pandita Za'ba. Pandita Za'ba gave the preface of this 29-year-old who was still an undergraduate. Yes, Za'ba gave the preface. Za'ba said, dia memiliki jiwa seorang Sufi. At 29, yes, rangkaian rubaiyat. Most of us have already passed 29, kan? Where's our book of poetry? Dalam itu you will see some of his poetry itu. It would survive until his old age. It would still be significant. For example, when he said, Barus, singkil, pasai dan ranir, silam ditelan masa nan mungkir. Lupa jawaban dihafal mahir, bagi menyangkal mungkar dan nakir. Barus, singkil, pasai dan ranir, silam ditelan masa nan mungkir. Banyak yang karam tiada tertaksir. Lupa jawaban dihafal mahir. Lepas tu Muslim tergenggam belenggu kafir, akhiratnya luput, dunianya tercicir. Lupa jawaban dihafal mahir, bagi menyangkal mungkar dan nakir. That is still true about the Muslims today, isn't it? Muslim tergenggam belenggu kafir, akhiratnya luput, dunianya pun tercicir. Yes? You lost your akhirah already now. But in the world, you're not doing the best anyways, isn't it? And now you have forgotten what to answer munkar dan nakir. He wrote this in 1959. And during that rangkaian rubaiyat, he was also commenting on Rabindranath Tagore. He was commenting on Allama Iqbal. He was correcting Fitzgerald, who was Fitzgerald was translating the rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam into English. According to Professor Nagib Al-Attas, some of the things that he translated from Persian into English really did not fit with the proper meters of the rubai. One, and secondly, he took some liberties with regards to even the content, such that he westernized some of the ideas of Umar Khayyam. So, what do we learn from this, biographical aspect? Yes, is that he deals with the greatest thinkers of the West. He doesn't waste his time with indie books. He doesn't waste his time with, just journalistic kind of writings, just operators, academic operators who are just looking to make a name. He reads the great works. Because why? And even when he wants to refute, he refutes from the greatest thinkers. That's why in his theory of happiness here, with regards to the West, he compares it with Aristotle. That's the greatest achievement in Western thought. It used to be said of Aristotle by Dante. Yes, you know Dante? Dante Alighieri. Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy. Yes, this Divine Comedy is a trilogy consisting of the Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. This is the greatest, it is said by the Western people, the Western scholars, this is the greatest literary achievement of the medieval period. Yes, the Middle Ages. It was their greatest achievement. It was a very lengthy poem written in the vernacular language, not in Latin, but in Italian. Until today, Dante Alighieri's work is still read in their best high schools. And this Dante Alighieri, what he said of Aristotle, Aristotle is the master of all who knows. Yes, the master of all who knows. So that's what Professor Al-Attas deals with. And even the best minds of the Muslim world, who do they deal with? They deal with only with the best ones. Ibn Sina read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times. Yes. Sampai habis baca 40 times, he said he didn't understand it. Then one day, there was a book peddler who told him, belilah buku ni bang. He bought. It turns out it was a summary of Aristotle's ideas or Aristotle's Metaphysics by Al-Farabi. He read it once, and all the ideas of Aristotle started showing itself in his mind. Then he understood Aristotle's Metaphysics, through which he developed his own metaphysics in his Kitabun Najat, in his own Shifa. Yes, brilliant. Ibn Sina's Metaphysics is a brilliant work. I mean, anyone who wants to start on Islamic philosophy, cannot afford to ignore Ibn Sina. Because even in Imam al-Ghazali's elaborate system, there is elements of Ibn Sina. In Aquinas, there is Ibn Sina. In Western tradition, there is Ibn Sina. Not to say Ibn Sina of the canon of medicine. This is not Ibn Sina of the Qanun fit Tib. Ibn Sina's Qanun fit Tib, yes, lasted him until the 17th century. He was still studying in the university. But his philosophy is much more brilliant than that. Because he himself, out of his own admission, said that by a certain age, he was already bored of medicine. It didn't really prove a challenge to him, such that he wanted to pursue the more abstract sciences, particularly metaphysics, which to him was the queen of the sciences. So, Imam al-Ghazali likewise, in the Tahafatul Falasifa, he doesn't pay attention to all these minor thinkers. Yes, in the Muqaddimah, yes, in the in the third Muqaddimah of the Tahafatul Falasifa, he said he wants to set out a refutation of the philosophers. And the only ones that he considered are three: Aristotle, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina. Aristotle because he represented the greatest representative of Greek thought. Then Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina because these two represented the best of the Muslim philosophers who appropriated the ideas of Aristotle. Likewise, Professor Alatas, he deals with Aristotle. He deals with Plato. So courage, yes? There's courage. You need courage with regards to knowledge. You need courage to read the greats. Even when I was in university, you know, the lecturers there, they scorn at their students if they hear you use Wikipedia. I'm setting for you, for history of Western philosophy, to read Bertrand Russell, isn't it? For them, you read Bertrand Russell if you didn't study, you know. That means to say, in the semester, you didn't study, so therefore you have 1 week before the exam, read Bertrand Russell. But in reality, you should have read the direct translations of Aristotle and Plato, and these great thinkers one after another. So that's how you raise your intellect, because Gedanken sind free. Yes, that's what the Germans say. Gedanken sind free. That means to say your mind is free, isn't it? Who's to tell you that you cannot read Aristotle? Is there any law? His books are not banned, you know? Except that you set yourself, you impose upon yourself the false shackles, isn't it? You impose upon yourself that you are only allowed to read summaries of summaries of summaries. Not even secondary work, you read tertiary works. Dalam kelas minta notes, isn't it? Not to say read the primary materials, not even secondary materials. You read out of the textbook. You're asking a note for notes. How can you read Professor Alatas? Yes. But Prof. Alatas, you know, his youth was like that. He read it gradually, little by little, until it becomes there. And even then, out of his own admission, he says, I don't read a lot, he said. I don't read a lot, he said. I think much, he said. I don't read a lot. But, you know, when he says he doesn't read a lot, you look at the bibliography. Allahu Akbar. If he says he doesn't read a lot, how about ourselves, isn't it? Where are we in this? We don't read at all, that means, if he doesn't read a lot. Anyways, inshallah, as we progress into the course, we will update you more and more about the life of Professor Naqib Al-Atas. But sufficient it is for you to know that how he arrives at this ability to write like this. One thing was that in order to develop his language, we said he read the best literature. Because in the best literature, the best words are used. Because that's how the Quran was, isn't it? In hadal Quran, ma'dabatullah fil ard. Allah says that this Quran is God's banquet on earth. And Prophet Alatas gave this tafsir of this, or an interpretation of this, when he said, ma'dabatullah fil ard, that means to say a banquet. A banquet is not a meal. A meal is where a family sits down together, makan kuih tiaw like that, everyone is happy. A banquet is when you have nobility. A banquet is when you have nobility of execution. That means to say there is proper timing. And then the cutleries. Yes, you don't have just one fork, but a number of forks, isn't it? People come there well dressed, and people there, they are seated according to their positions. And even the speech is already ordered, elocuted, and enunciated, and discussed in a manner that is precise. People say just the right things during a banquet. So just as Professor Atta said, the Quran is the ma'dabatullah fil ard. He's now acting with adab on the Quran. Yes. What is the adab that he affords the Quran? That means to say he respects individual terms in the Quran. He knows, for example, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not use the multiple words for creation just for color. That means to say just so that this rhymes with this and that rhymes with that. He distinguishes. There is a difference between ja'ala, khalaqa, ansha'a, and all this. And using this, he develops a theory of creation that is to rival the present day fascination with the evolutionary theory. Likewise, his analysis of the word deen, for example, relies on his respect of the word in the Quran. He knows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just use the word willy-nilly like that, but that accept that every word in terms of the signification of meaning there too. So he puts language as something extremely very important. That's why he says language reflects ontology. Your language reflects how well your mind grasps reality. And he said there, where language fails, the mind takes over. But where the mind fails, the heart takes over. Yes. But obviously, there is going to be a large difference between the language of an alim and the language of somebody who is not an alim. And there he distinguishes. That's why there is kalam, there is nutuk. Yes, there's differences in terms of the language. In reality, if you keep reading Professor Nagib Al-Atas, what will happen is that it will rearrange your mind. It will improve your mind. It will, it's like having a good linguistic command allows for smooth sailing in thinking, because mind operates on the principle of language. Language is the carriers of meaning. So therefore, the more precise your understanding of something, the better. He used to give this analogy that your akal utilizes the physical body. Your akal is the spiritual principle of cognition. It utilizes your brain. However, it sharpens it, like a knife, until eventually it reaches the maximum utility. At that stage, you're ready to grasp abstract things. At that stage, your akal becomes akal al-mustafad. It becomes useful already. It is no longer akal in the state of potential. Yes, it is akal in the state of actualized. Therefore, that's why the Quran may ask rhetorically, isn't it? Hal yastawi alladhina ya'lamun walladhina la ya'lamun. Somebody who knows and somebody who doesn't, are they the same? They're not. They may look the same. Yes, they may even be twins, isn't it? They may have the same genetic component, but the one has his akal already activated and the one does not. So they are not thinking the same thoughts. Their ajar are different. Their tafakkur is different. Yes, the things that concern them will be different. So this is the mufakkir that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted in the Malay world. So we said just now that of the books of the Dutch, he read the literature of the West, he read their philosophy and so on, until he went to Sandhurst, yes, military college in the UK, the Royal Military College, because of his family connections. He went there to the UK. At that time, during the holidays, he will spend time in Alhambra, in Spain, yes, in Northern Africa. There he met some of the mashayikh, yes, amongst the Shadilis, the Hassanis. He's a very well-traveled man. That's why one of the things that he used to ask some of his students or some of his friends is, where have you been in the world? Yes. ardullah wasi'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this world with so many secrets. Where have you been in it? That means to say, who have you met? What have you read? Yes, who have you met? What have you read? Who have you listened to? Who have you sat with? Gedangkan sin free. Yes, your mind is free, but you're the one who imposed shackles upon yourself. So, with this kind of things, during that time, he also met with the young princess from the Middle East. Yes, the young leaders of the Qaba'il who were there in Britain. He became friends. This develops a certain level of confidence in him also. So when he came back to Malaysia, at first he joined the army. Yes, and after a while he gave a voluntary resignation. Then but sufficient time he spent in the army because of this military training, that he fought with the communists and so on, until his biographer in the Shamsul Zahira. Yes, the Shamsul Zahira is a biographical dictionary that is updated. It contains the history and the biography of the Ba'alawis from the past, Faqih Muqaddam and the greats, but also includes the more recent ones. And Professor Nagib Al-Atas' entry, there he's given the title Rabbul Saif wal Qalam. Yes, the Lord of sword and pen. Yes, that means to say, he who understands not just scholarship but politics, he who understands nationhood, he who understands many things. Yes, remember in his teenage, he was there when Dato' On was planning the independence of this country, or our neighbor, Malaysia. Yes, he was there. He was the one who designed the UMNO flag. Yes. While he was 16, he designed the UMNO flag, including the symbolism there. He thought about it. UKM, he's one of the founding fathers. Yes, he was the one who put the motto, Rabbi Zidni Ilma. That was his idea, his conception. In the beginning, even the logo of UKM was his design. He put there a lion holding a torch. That means to say, courage guided by knowledge. Later, when he was replaced, they changed the logo. Now they put a lion or a tiger holding a knife. Allahu Akbar. What does that mean? Violent courage, isn't it? Itu berani bodoh namanya, isn't it? You're already a tiger to begin with, no light of knowledge, and then you give a weapon to that person, habis, isn't it? That's why you demonstrate every week, without knowledge. Courage guided by knowledge, that's supposed to be the idea. But just because, kita orang Melayu ni kena ada keris, orang letak keris. Allahu Akbar. So, yes. Now let's give a bit more background about the discussion on happiness. So, why is happiness suddenly a problem? Yes, because in the intellectual tradition of Islam, happiness has already been known ever since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And have a specific term, yes, to refer to happiness. Yes, sa'ada, yes, is the word for happiness, and its opposite, shaqawa. Sa'ada means generally, good fortune. That means to say, as decided by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Sa'ada is deeply related with the question of iman, having sound knowledge, certainty, isn't it? That can be discerned from some of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam also, isn't it? When he said that one of the things that has been pre-decided for you when you were in your mother's womb, includes whether or not you're going to be sa'idan or syaqiyan. That means to say whether you will be happy or you will be, kalau bahasa Melayunya, sama ada bahagia seseorang itu atau celaka dia, like that. And then you find, for example, there is the hadith of the Prophet in which he said, one of you will have the amal of the Ahlul shaqi, or that means to say the people of hellfire, until you're only a very short distance, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has it in his knowledge that you're of the opposite group, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes you, and vice versa. But suddenly, as a result of modern Western ways of thinking, something has happened, in the Muslim world. According to Prof. Alatas, two things. One is that the children of our generation, or the young of our generation, has been cut off from their intellectual and spiritual tradition. One. Secondly, you have been introduced with the Western methods and modes and means of thinking. These are the two chief causes that leads to the confusion and error in knowledge in our times. Yes, as a result of that, clear concepts become suddenly vague. You don't understand it anymore. As a result of that, there is confusion with regards to fundamental and basic terms. Knowledge, for example, which is a key term in our worldview, Al-Ilm, is now suddenly equated with employment. Yes, is equated with scientific research. Knowledge is equated with marketability. Yes, keboleh pasaran. That means to say you pursue knowledge for the sake of this world. That's the meaning of knowledge now. In fact, it is the greatest knowledge. The orders of the Fardu Ain and the Fardu Kifayah has been reversed. Knowledge. Life also becomes, as a result of the corruption and error in knowledge, what happens is that your conception of life has changed also. The conception of life that was God-centric, akhirah-centric, becomes reversed. Now all there is a focus on this world. It's very difficult to remove it once it's become part of your worldview like that. And then you have confusion and restriction which comes from the internal cause, not coming from the West per se, but coming from the Muslims themselves. And this has even been noticed by Imam Al-Ghazali in the Kitab Al-Ilm. He said that the chief problem amongst the Muslims is the restriction of key terms. For example, Imam Al-Ghazali noticed that the term fiqh in the Quran, in the hadith, doesn't mean jurisprudence. As in the hadith, in the Quran, in the early generations, it didn't mean jurisprudence. In fact, as late as Imam Abu Hanifa, fiqh was not restricted to jurisprudence. That is why there is the Fiqhul Akbar, which is not a book on jurisprudence. But knowledge has been reduced to fiqh to such an extent that the fundamental elements of the worldview is now forgotten. Perhaps some of these scholars who were in the tradition themselves, maybe they were experts on fiqh, but at the same time they were also masters of tasawwuf and aqidah. But there were people who, out of their, for example, out of their zeal to master fiqh, out of their knowledge that at certain points in history, the science that can give them employability was fiqh. During that time, for example, during the Umayyads and the Abbasid period, yes, they can be hired as qadis, yes, because of the tajdid of Sayyidina Umar bin Abdul Aziz. Yes, what he did with was to co-opt, shall we say, the religious class within the ruling class. Whereas previously the fatwa were, for example, during the time of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in, they were given as a matter of the authority of individual scholars. But during the time of Umar Abdul Aziz, the machinery of the government has evolved to such an extent that you can hire people to give fatwas. So therefore, there would be competition and races because there is prestige. And as a result, the writers amongst the Sufis, those who held on to the proper path of tasawwuf, and those who learn in an unbroken chain, they wrote works criticizing such groups of people. Yes, Imam Al-Ghazali himself wrote about the ulama as-su, ulama bid-dunya, and he spoke about these people, those, and then they gave certain judgments pertaining to how should scholars react pertaining to the state, how should they perceive wealth, so on and so on and so forth. This because the problem was original in this sense. Now, there was a restriction of key terms, fiqh, like that. Another key term was the equation of al-ilm with fiqh. And many more, yes, of this type. Some of it was coincidental because of the growth of the science. It is such that it is possible, for example, for somebody to study kalam and spend his life in it, and as a result found wanting in the other disciplines. As Imam al-Ghazali himself in the Munqidh min ad-Dalal, he notes that the study of kalam is good as antidote, but the sole pursuit of kalam, not for the sake of curing your doubt, may introduce doubts, like that. So from the internal as well as the external problems, the result is that even with regards to the fundamental key terms, it's no longer pristine in the mind of the Muslims. And what are the fundamental key terms in the worldview of Islam? There is 9. Can I? These are the first: God, revelation, knowledge, man, happiness, yes, religion, education. Oh, well, let's stop here first. Now these words, especially those with a secular background, let's add one more, world. These words are the same in Islam and in the West, but they carry different meanings, isn't it? For example, what does this word revelation mean? Supposedly it is al-wahi, isn't it? Knowledge, likewise, is supposed to be al-ilm. Man, al-insan. World, dunya, maybe alam also. Yet, this word now, world, has been limited to the here and now, isn't it? To just that which can be seen. No longer encompassing ad-dunya wal akhirah, in which the akhirah is the one that is supposed to contain ultimate and final significance. The word God also. People are no longer sensitive, isn't it, as to what it means. Whether or not the God that is conceived by the Muslims and the God that is conceived by science, are they the same? What is the method before they knew the meaning of God? Happiness, likewise. Right now there's a happiness index. There is depression and anxiety. Happiness is understood as having vacations, isn't it? Happiness is understood as the opposite of being stressed. Empty, isn't it? No longer having any spiritual connotation. Knowledge, likewise. All these are very key terms. This has suffered changes. Until what time do we want to meet? Shall we start at 10 o'clock? Now it's 9:40. It's okay? All right. I'd like to give room for some questions also, if there are any. And then in the final wrap-up, I'll speak a bit more about happiness, because we promised to speak a bit about happiness. Any questions? Comments? Disagreements? Oh, okay. Yes. Itulah, now I've come to realize that basically, since we have decided to make this a more systematic discussion, it's very difficult to start with happiness. Because happiness is not the first discussion. The first discussion is basically on the notion of worldview itself. Let me start just with the preface lah. Yes. The conception and conceptualization of knowledge and the sciences, as well as the adaptation of methods and theories, are in each civilization formulated within the framework of its own metaphysical system, forming its worldview. Yes. Conception and conceptualization of knowledge and the sciences. That means to say, knowledge, although not entirely a property of the human mind, has an element in which the human mind is responsible in conceiving, in conceptualizing. And then what we consider as valid methods are different in each civilization. For example, when it comes to the Western worldview, they have rejected revelation. Since they have rejected revelation, therefore, when they formulate knowledge, they will formulate it based on the framework of rationalism and empiricism. That means to say, rationalism, i.e. the human intellect, empiricism, i.e. human experience. Just experience and the intellect. Like that. That's what they consider to be valid sources of knowledge. In other civilizations, maybe they don't articulate it, but they make claims about the existence of things which are non-empirical in nature. Supposing if there are still amongst your Chinese friends, those who believe in the existence of ghosts, those who still believe in the existence of their ancestors and their ability to talk with them, that means to say they affirm an alternative source of knowledge. In the Greek old times, yes, before they became secularized and they became philosophers, they used to believe that the poets had special abilities. Yes, the poets had contact with the gods, like that. And what they were writing is inspired like that. So therefore, the method of learning would be likewise different. Now, with regards to Islam, our conception and conceptualization of knowledge and the sciences, yani al-ulum Islamiyah, as well as the adaptation of methods and theories, ultimately is sourced from the Quran. Although we accept reason, we also accept empiricism. That means to say, we accept sense experience, we accept sound reason. But yet, ultimately, we know that the source of all knowledge is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran is a guide, not just in terms of the actual doctrines, but even on the method of thinking, the method of arriving at conclusions. For example, in Surah Al-Kahfi, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in conclusion of the debate about the number of people in the cave, whether there was 3 ke 5 ke 7 ke, and the dog tu. They say this, they say this, they say this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. And then Allah says, Rajman bil ghaib. That was the method they utilized. That means to say, guesswork in a state of darkness. That means to say, where there is no proper applicability of guesswork. That means to say there is no deciding factor for you to determine whether it was this or that. Just like sometimes, for example, when the Western people, with regards to history in this part of the world, Professor Alatas said that Sheikh Hamzah Fansuri was living in the 16th century. Yes, he was definitely living in the 16th century, or circa 16th/17th century, maybe. But what is clear, 16th century. But the Western people say, well, if he lives in the 16th century, what year was he born in? They ask him this sort of questions. And this is again, Rajman bil Ghaib, isn't it? We don't know that. But in our intellectual tradition, the method employed is minal ma'lum, minal majhul. From that which you know, you arrive at that which you did not know. So the way we adapt, our scholars adapt the methods and theories with regards to knowledge is specific to our own tradition. So this Rajman bil Ghaib, Allah says, therefore, وَلَا تُمَارِ فِيهِمْ إِلَّا مِرَاءً ظَاهِرًا. Therefore, do not dispute with them, because why should you dispute with these people? Now there, and then in another, the Quran is full of what we call epistemology. That means to say theory of knowledge, how knowledge is formed. That means to say before you can make claims to knowledge, there must be an experience that can validate that claim. There are various surahs in which Allah says, how did they know this? Did they receive a book? Were they there? These are all principles that the Quran set in terms of valid method to arrive at a conclusion, including, for example, with regards to certain spiritual matters. Yes, i.e. with regards to the Prophet Muhammad's knowledge of God. There you find in Surah An-Najm, where Allah says, مَا كَذَبَ الْفُؤَادُ مَا رَأَى. Yes, his heart did not lie pertaining to what he saw with his spiritual heart. مَا زَغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى. Now this مَا زَغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى, it did not deviate, nor did it exceed its limits. Out of this is derived another principle of knowledge with regards to our intellectual tradition, that is, with regards to the limits of truth. That means to say, for every object of knowledge, there is a limit of truth. If you exceed, you're going to miss the meaning. If you fall short, you're not going to get it. This is similar with the verse, فَمَاذَا بَعْدَ الْحَقِّ. What then is after the truth, except dalal, deviation? Professor Alatas gives another example, about this limit of truth. Take, for example, the painting of Mona Lisa. In reality, is the painting of Mona Lisa always the painting of Mona Lisa? To the observer, is she always? That means to say, is the painting always an object of beauty? There's a limit of the beauty of Mona Lisa. One of the limits pertains to the distance, isn't it? The Mona Lisa is not a Mona Lisa from 5 centimeters. It may be the actual Mona Lisa, but from 5 centimeters, you do not see any meaning, isn't it? Likewise, she's not Mona Lisa from 1 kilometer, isn't it? From 1 kilometer, what do you see? It's just that's Mona Lisa. So there's limits of truth, even with regards to perception, isn't it? That means to say, beyond which is no longer valid. That's why, for example, with regards to our scholars, that's how they adopted. There's some level of precision, isn't it? Our scholars, they adopt with regards to perception of celestial objects. When does it fall? When do you celebrate it? When do you so that means to say, with regards to astronomy, that's why our scholars can develop that. That is developed out of our own understanding of what knowledge is, the tradition as it projects it. Take, for example, the Batu Bersurat of Terengganu. The Batu Bersurat of Terengganu, 1303. Jumaat pertama di bulan Rajab, 4th of Rajab, the first Friday night, in which the moon was at the constellation of Saratan. That's a very precise statement, isn't it? The moon can only be in one place at that night. It cannot be at many places. And that constellation is also known. That means to say, certain time of the year, this is what you will see in the night sky. And because of that precision that our scholars did establish in 1303, there could be, in 2002, two physicists who studied in the US, yes. One of them studied in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He developed a computer program that can trace the night sky view from all the places in the world. That means you just place your GPS location, the night sky is already mapped. So that means you say, kan kalau the earth rotates and revolves, so you will be able to know exactly. So he placed the exact dates as established in the Batu Bersurat. And where was the moon? Exactly where our scholars said it. The adaptation of methods is with regards to a principle of justice in the religion of Islam. That's why we know, for example, with regards to limits of truth, another example is with regard to chairs. Yeah? For many people, the chair doesn't present an epistemological challenge. That means it's not a problem of knowledge. But if you start asking, what is the chair made of? Katalah it's made of wood. Where did the wood come from? The wood came from Johor. And then from Johor. Lepas tu you ask furthermore, what about the properties of the wood? Does it last long, and so on and so forth? Some more, sampai lah chemical properties of the tree, the chemical property at the cellular level, how long does it last, and so on and so forth. What happens? The chair has already disappeared, isn't it? The chair has gone already from the object of knowledge. That means to say you have exceeded the limit of truth with regards to the chair. It's no longer a chair at that level. So at the cellular level, it's not a chair, because the chair is only a chair for the human-seated form. It's an object designed for human-seated form, beyond which it's a different matter now altogether. Just like, for example, the origins of America. When should you say is the origins of America? Should you date it to the time when Columbus landed? Or should you date it according to when the Indians were there, or the Red Indians? Or should you go even further? When the American continent split from the... you keep going like this, in the end you say, to the point of the creation of the world. By then you have already exceeded the limit of truth, like that. So right now our problem is that we don't know where is the limit of truth for each and proper discussion. And that is also a sign of loss of adab. Because adab doesn't just mean, etiquette, loss of etiquette, maksudnya jadi orang kurang hajar, itu like that. Loss of adab, that means to say even with regards to thinking. People don't know where is the limit of their knowledge, beyond which that they shouldn't talk. Yes? That if they had remained within their limits of truth, they would have been safe. Just like the case of the Banu Israel, when they were commanded to slaughter a cow, they continue and continue like that. That's a trait of a people that exceeds the limits of truth. Another one with regards to eagles. Yeah? Why is it that human beings are not given the vision of eagles? And they can see a few kilometers away. Well, if we were given the vision of eagles, there cannot be civilization. All of us, where do the eagles where do they make their nests? In very high places, because they cannot see from a short distance like that. They have to aim for there to like that. If human beings were like that, then khalas, no civilization. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made everything just as a proper measure for you to derive knowledge. And so the adaptation of the methods and theories are in each civilization formulated within the framework of its own metaphysical system, forming its worldview. Understand this. This is what Prof. Alatas is trying to say. Yes? Understand this. That our own tradition has produced ulum Islamiyah that is fulfilling the purpose of knowing. Yes? In our intellectual tradition, scientific inquiries are done for the purpose of the proper knowing. For example, with regards to That's why we didn't develop the science of astrobiology. You know astrobiology? The science of trying to find out if there were extraterrestrial beings. Why didn't our scholars delve on that? Because that would exceed the limits of knowing. Because for us, the meaning of life is already understood within the Quran. We are made here for this world. Buang masa tu, you know, this going to all these planets and so on. They've been feeding us since our childhood, isn't it? Yes, in our childhood we have been fed with these ideas that there must be some planet out there that is more suitable for mankind. There must be some place that you can find justice because there is no justice in this world, like that. And they give you the idea, yeah, not enough with aliens, predators, and so on and so forth. Every year they make a new thing. Why? Because they want to challenge the idea of a universe, the idea of a cosmos as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it. Whereas, what is the proof that they had? Except for their وَلَا تُمَارِ فِيهِمْ إِلَّا مِرَاءً ظَاهِرًا. Yes, do not indulge them in these things. Each metaphysical system, and thus also the worldview it projects, is not the same for every other civilization. It differs from one another in accordance with the differences in the interpretation of what is taken to be ultimately true and real. Now, this is a fundamental source of difference between the worldview of Islam and the worldview of the West. Because for us, there is something which is fundamentally true, something which is fundamentally real. And that which is fundamentally true and that which is fundamentally real is given via revelation. And there is a principle of verifying that. It is done through ibadah. It is done through getting the proper fardu ain and the performance of the acts which is required, which gives birth to certainty. But in the West, no. There's continuous undoing of a vision. You arrive at a synthesis, you produce an antithesis. Yes, and then gradually like that, time immemorial. There is no setting your limit on a single truth. For us, there is a work, the Quran. And then there is the Prophet who embodies the Quran. There is one vision of reality and truth, Al-Akhirah and the Dunya. So therefore here, if knowledge and the sciences that grow from it are not aligned to the statements and general conclusions of revealed truth, then what is taken to be true may not always be truly so, nor what is taken to be real to be really so. And such interpretation must therefore undergo recurrent corrective revision, necessitating what is called paradigm shifts, which involve also changes in the worldview and the metaphysical system that projects it. We do not agree with those who take the position that reality and truth and values derived from them are separate, and that they articulate their meanings within the paradigms of relativity and plurality having equal validity. Let me just finish the paragraph before we continue. Since we maintain that knowledge is not entirely a property of the human mind, and that the sciences derived from it are not the product solely of unaided human reason, and sense experience possessing an objectivity that preclude value judgment, but that knowledge and the sciences need guidance and verification from the statements and general conclusions of revealed truth, it is therefore incumbent upon scholars and the learned among us who are entrusted to teach, that means yourselves, yes, and to educate, to acquaint themselves with a clear understanding of the metaphysics of Islam and of the permanently established constituent elements of the worldview derived from it. This is because that metaphysics is not only established, i.e. the metaphysics of Islam, is not only established upon reason and experience as reflected in the intellectual and religious tradition of Islam, but also upon the articulation of the revealed religion itself about the nature of reality and of truth in verification of the revelation. The book that now lies between your hands sets forth preliminary discourses on the nature of the metaphysics of Islam. So now, in this preface, Prof. Alatas is already presenting to us the chief problem of our time, the most major problem that is suffered by the Muslims in our time, particularly those who have experienced the West, as well as Western education, as well as Western means of knowing. Yes, the real challenge is the challenge of metaphysics. What makna metaphysics? That means to say the notion of reality and truth. Yes, what is ultimately true, what is ultimately real. Your answer could be there is nothing true, there is nothing real. Reality is constantly changing. We can never arrive at a final articulation of truth. That's why in the West they talk about paradigm shifts. Yes, they were used to one paradigm until there's sufficient amount of contradiction, they propose a new paradigm. And then they sit with that paradigm. Until a number of significant amount of contradictions emerge, they propose a new paradigm, like that. One after another. But never settling. Yes. It's a very tragic reality. Yes. This is the West, In Islam and secularism, Prophet Allah said that about the modern present West. One of their reality is constant change. And for them, they equate change with progress. It's never settling. It's unsettling. That's why, despite them, recognizing that certain things are goods, yes, like that they want to pursue, like economic development, they want to pursue environmental safety, they want to pursue a number of things, yes. But even then, with regards to the ultimate question, they have no answer. In fact, they try to make these questions go away. Yes. So as a result, what do they have? So if, for example, they can never be sure of what reality and truth is, they have no answer of who man is also. Nor do they have an answer as to what is good and what is bad. These ultimate questions are metaphysical questions. In Islam, it's settled in the past. But now, due to this introduction of these alien ways of thinking, it's no longer as easy as that. Because right now, what Muslims suffer, which is more dangerous than ignorance, is confusion. Yes, in the past, you had what is called jahlul basit. That means to say, jahlul basit, that means to say simple form of ignorance that can be remedied through instruction. Our mashayikh in the past, like Ar-Raniri, when he heard about the problem of the lack of following of Islam in Kedah, that means to say, when he said, the people dah start kahwin orang Islam, campur bukan Islam, makan daging anjing, they do all sorts of crazy things. All that he needed to do is to write the Sirat al-Mustaqim. Yes, a book on Aqidah, book on Fiqh, and then Hadiyatul Habib fi Targhib wa Tarhib, a hadith of the Prophet. Okay, dispatch it. That will re-Islamize the people, because there is no source of confusion. There was only ignorance. But now, this ignorance is becoming fortified with something which appears to be truth, but not entirely true. Yes, it is shibhi in reality. It's mutashabih. There's really some similarities between what the West says and what you say. But the West is more advanced technologically. So that means to say what they have done is the truth. And then furthermore, because they give you the undertext of a history in which they progress and the Muslims were backward. And the reason for their progress was because they left behind their religion. So therefore, they want to drive it in our minds that the Muslims will progress as they do if we leave behind our religion. And this is where the origins of this contextualizing, yes? Because for them there is a notion of progress that is temporally, that means to say that is temporally designed. There was a time when we were less developed until the time that we become more developed. They project this evolutionary view upon history. Until many Muslims suffer from this too. Yes, very difficult, isn't it, to break this. A common argument now amongst Muslims, they will say, zaman dah berubah. Things have changed. We have progress now. And then they will say, how can you deny that there is progress? Because now we have vacuum cleaners. Now we have cars. They didn't have cars. Now we have this. They didn't have that. Now we have shorter ways of arriving at this, and they didn't have that. So therefore, we must be more progressive than they did. And if we are more progressive in the general day-to-day activities, menial activities, who's to say that even our knowledge of reality? Then they will say, eventually they will say this. And in fact, amongst the youth, they have already said it. If the Muslims were so clever back then, why didn't they discover about, geocentrism or heliocentrism? Why didn't the Quran settle this once for all? They will say, why didn't they know about so many things that we know now, if the Quran is already settled? Yes, how many things that science has discovered, and the Muslims who ape them from behind. What do the Muslims do? In fact, this is already in the Quran. What do? You use mental acrobatics to say, actually, even the Big Bang pun is in the Quran. And then, if there's some modification, even that is in the Quran. You look into this verse like that. And when all else fails, it's, you show a tomato, ada alif lam lam ha tu. Allah is in the tomato. Come on, look at my lion video. It says Allah, lion itu. Halas, that means to say you have lost the moral. You have lost your metaphysics. This is why Prof. Alatas gave this analogy in the Risalah untuk kaum muslimin. Dia kata dulu there was in this country a beautiful maiden. Every day people come and visit her. Look at her, just come out in the veranda and people came. It was a town event. As the years go by, the numbers started to become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until there were few who remained there. So then it was asked, why do you still stay here, and whereas the rest were going? Because for most of the people in this world are of the Ahlul Zahir. Yes, they think that Islam is external. So since externally Islam is, or the Muslims who are the representatives of Islam are backward, poor, and so on and so forth, so therefore they think that Islam too has lost its power, its appeal. Because Islam, in the beginning of history, within the first century, when it came out of Arabia, within 1 century, it got to Sardinia, it got to Spain, it got to Constantinople, it took most of the Eastern Roman Empire. Yes, Syria was previously Eastern Roman. Carthage, North Africa was Carthage. Egypt was amongst the protectorate of Alexander the Great, and hiding it is the thin under that veneer is the Egyptian civilization, the Mesopotamian, the Babylonian, the Sumerian civilization. Who were these Arabs? They were Muslims. They were nowhere in the world map before, but suddenly they emerged in the world scene and they took control over this. And then, what was called the Mediterranean Lake, yes, the Mediterranean Lake, yes, is the major link of connection between the Western Europeans and the civilized world. Because you look at the map, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Sumeria, all these ancient civilizations, including Egypt, these were the chief source of Western culture. Plato himself went to Egypt when Socrates couldn't give him the answers. The mystery religions, Pythagoras, they all went to Egypt for the answers. When Islam took over Egypt and took over all this Mediterranean region, it became a Muslim lake. And when it became a Muslim lake, the West was cut off. And when they became cut off from the Muslim civilization, coupled with the advancing of the Muslim military, even the Pope who was a Roman Pope, he had to move northwards. Seeking help from whom? Seeking help from the European barbarians who used to conquer them. Yes, whom they considered barbarians, lower than them, but he had to seek help from them. He had to legitimize Frankish rule. Yes, the forefathers of the Europeans today. Yes, he legitimized siapa? Charlemagne. Charlemagne united the European peoples, and out of that they gradually recovered, and then they launched their first crusades. But it was only after a few hundred years when they had the Reconquista, that means to say when they reconquered Spain, few hundred years, Muslim provenance. Why? Because that time, the Muslims were very confident of themselves. They were, they were very hungry for knowledge. All the works that were translated were co-opted, adopted, according to the metaphysics of Islam. Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, when they looked at the ideas of Aristotle, yes, that which is congenial, they maintain. And that which would add to their understanding, they add. And that which is harmful, which is detrimental to the understanding, they remove. That which needed to be Islamized, they Islamized. That's what our scholars were doing. It was a very systematic process. As a result was the growth of the scientific tradition of Islam. Within 2 centuries, we had a scientific conceptual scheme, and this is something abstract, yes? Scientific conceptual scheme. We had a development of particular scientific terminologies. We had a class of scholars, yes, whose work is to develop the scientific processes. We were already a very powerful civilization intellectually, spiritually, morally. We developed these Islamic sciences to such great ends. At that time, of course, it's easy to fall in love with Islam, isn't it? Because externally also you would be powerful. What more internally, isn't it? But gradually, when because of internal problems, loss of adab, you get scholars vying for the dunya, you get kings who perform blunders, who attack their own peoples, you get scholars whose sole concern is about this dunya and about politics and about legal matters, no longer thinking about the development of their spiritual selves. As a result, you get internal warfare. Gradually, for example, after Tamerlane, yes, Timur could have used his military power to attack China and Russia. Yes. And had he done that, imagine how different world history would have been. But instead of using his army to attack China and Russia, who did he attack? Baghdad. Said, I'm here to punish the Muslims. He is a Muslim. Why? That is so jadi, what happened is that, in another story, Prof. Al-Atas kata, like a husband lah, in the first years of marriage, when he looked at his wife, she would be the most beautiful. Every day he would be praising her. One day, if the husband sits with the wife and do kat buayan, he look at her face, say, I just noticed there's actually a mole on your cheek. Why didn't I notice there was a mole on your cheek before? And the wife said, the mole has always been there. But dulu masa cinta tengah berkobar-kobar, when you were really in love with me, you didn't see the mole. You only saw perfection. Like that. Like Muslims today, kan? Dulu, when Islam tengah cantik, tengah indah, tengah diwakili oleh panglima-panglima yang hebat itu, alim ulama, agung, all these things, easy to fall in love with Islam. But now, only those who understood the reality of Islam, the truth of its spiritual aspect, will remain. But budaya jahil luas membanjir, banyak yang karam tiada tertaksir, isn't it, in our time? In our time, so many people will see and look at Islam with disdain, with disgust, his fellow Muslims as backward, because they don't see any worth. That's why there is this project of restoring Islamic metaphysics. That means, you see, why does he want to restore metaphysics? Because before you can make people understand the significance of fiqh, before you can make people understand the significance of the fineries of tasawwuf, before you can make people understand the debates of the scholars in ilm al-aqidah, tajweed, and so on and so forth, first they need to have understanding of the reality and truth. First, they need to have their doubts about religion removed. First, you cannot have Muslims who are secretly doubting, why is it that science discovers the opposite of what my religion says? You cannot have that. For as long as the metaphysics is not sound, for as long as knowledge, revelation is not properly understood, for as long as they think that the Quran is just another book, for as long as they think that the Quran was a cultural product, for as long as all these fundamental elements are not yet purified, before we have performed the tazkiyah of all these things, the other bangunan-bangunan ilmu tu cannot be built on top of it. Unless you have a special case of people who are not disturbed with the Western worldview, which will be very rare. You're a very rare case, because at a young age, you've already went there. Ataupun you don't pay attention much to Western worldview. Then you can be safe. But to what extent, isn't it? You meet somebody in the internet, you meet somebody in the government, everyone else will be taken aback by these ideas that the West projects. And they have behind them scientific prowess, economic prowess, technological prowess. And what do Muslims have externally? Tak ada. So therefore you must have first proper metaphysics, which cannot be unseated dulu. That's why he asked the first question, do you have certainty or not of your religion? Yes. Syak tak boleh. Dhan tak boleh. There must be yakin. Do you have certainty or not of your religion? Cannot be a cultural thing. Religion cannot be something that you inherit from your parents. Religion cannot be like a sort of nostalgia. Religion is not lagu raya zaman 90-an. Oh, I feel, when I go to semayang hari raya tu, I feel a certain nostalgia. I feel like crying bila takbir raya tu. But yet, in your worldview, you've been corrupted. All this talk. Okay, sorry. So basically, in terms of first, forgive me for this talking like a harangue, going left and right and so on, because in the first discussion, it's customary like this to see the rhythm of the class. But the worldview of Islam, inshallah, as we go into the chapters, we'll analyze one part from another, beginning with, of course, in the introduction, the definition of the worldview will be discussed first, alternative definitions, and then after the discussion of the worldview, what it includes, and then after what it includes, what are the fundamental elements, and then one element, how it connects with the other, and so on. Professor Alatas is a very systematic thinker. He's an architectonic thinker, in fact. What you call an architectonic thinker is a thinker whose every idea is connected with another idea within a system. So yes, this is one of the arcs of our time, yes, that will protect your aqidah from. But it's a specific thing, isn't it? In fact, it's not. It shouldn't be a universal thing, because Western worldview shouldn't be a universal idea. But it's become a universal idea. You're raised with this. You cannot avoid it. In Malaysia, ada lagi ability to. If you have a farm, you stay on the mountain. Boleh lagi, you can think of being protected from the Western worldview. Bawa kambing, like that. But in Singapore, will you have the freedom of not indulging in the Western worldview? Because there is a thin veneer behind day-to-day discourse. Do you have a television in your homes? You do. Habis lah, tak boleh buat apa-apa lah, isn't it? The Trojan horse is already inside. If you have Netflix, habis. If your children watch YouTube, khalas. If your children watch Anna and Elsa, Frozen, if they watch Frozen, if they watch Incredibles, they're going to get these ideas. Nanti the next thing you know, they're going to suffer depression and anxiety. Ya'adzubillah. But it happens. It happens. People believe in the here and now, no longer in the hereafter. They will consider that this religion is like the asatir al-awwalin. They just have nostalgic relation to it. And some of them, they may master fiqh. I know a person, yes? You study with the mashayikh, the Hanabila, he said. His background was in usul al-fiqh. Yes? And then he went to a European university. Balik, he still knows his fiqh. He still knows his usul. That means to say he can still give you, the hukum is like this, like this, like this. But what does he think now? He thinks, he said, these are judgments that was more suitable for a previous time. Yes, the Prophet Muhammad, his ideas, the hukum and so on, was suitable for a different time. Now we have to understand our time. And this is not the first time you hear this kind of arguments, isn't it? Khalas, This man still can do that. And when he performs salah, he still performs salah. He knows the hukum like this, like this, like this, like this. He can give you advice like that. But in his worldview, He no longer knows whether Islam is the only true religion or there could be other true religions. What is the argument that says that Islam is the only true religion? He says perhaps that other people also know the truth about reality. Transcendental unity of religions. Yes. Perennialism. All these ideas are slowly seeping through because the Western worldview doesn't attack you at your strongest points. It will attack you at the things that you have not yet developed. It attacks you at your conception of reality and truth because they appear to be the ones that hold the monopoly of it. Yes, there was just some time ago, I met and discussed with some young boys. Yes, 16, 17-year-olds, they're asking questions like, isn't it true that in the Quran, for example, the Qawmi Lut, they ask, were they punished because of the sin of indulging in homosexuality, or was it because of rape? So they want to distinguish between the two. That means to say they want to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that punishment upon the people because these people forced themselves against Nabi Lut's guests. Where did you get that kind of thinking? It has never been proposed like that in our past. I said, who's your teacher? They don't know, is that? Because it's now in the air like that. They can read it in Twitter accounts, they can read it in Facebook, and there is no writer. And when there is no writer, there is truly the writer is Shaitan. Shaitan is putting these things, One of them said, like, what if, for example, they say masturbation, maaf cakap lah. They say, what if it's good and conducive for good health? What if there are scientific journals that prove that it is indispensable for good health? Does it mean that the Sharia is wrong? It's like, astaghfirullah. How do they reason like this? And what can you say in return? In the past, it was easy. The people will just say, Ustaz, apa hukumnya begini? And you give them and they answer, betul lah, okay, baik Ustaz. But now, if their question is like this, they're no longer asking you for the hukum, isn't it? They want to know, what is your moral, intellectual basis for defending what is halal and haram in Islam? Some of them come up with more elaborate questions, How do you know that Prophet Muhammad exists? Well, I'm not asking this to justify this course. I'm not asking this as a matter of scaring. This is just, personal experiences. So, the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam is an introduction to our conception of reality and truth, so that we have a strong and secure foundation. And furthermore, the greatest benefit, the fawaid of studying this discipline is that once the certainty has been ingrained, it can also be imparted. It can be taught. Yes, Islamization is a real thing. It can be done like that. Inshallah, it will save our ummah, hopefully. Inshallah, amin. Afwan, I'm sorry for taking more time. Shall we conclude? Or do you want any more? Ada lagi soalan? Okay, no questions? Inshallah, it's okay. There's more. Oh yes. Well, as it is said here, the worldview of Islam is not addressed to Western people. It is addressed to Muslims. For us, It's not a matter of thesis and antithesis. We understood about the limits of truth just now. We understand that knowledge is not something out there. Yes? The conception of reality and truth is not something external to human beings. It's inward. The property of knowledge is spiritual in nature. It is a latifa ruhaniyah. It can be felt. Once the certainty is there, it cannot be dislodged. So therefore, once you grasp the proper vision of reality and truth as projected by revelation, inshallah in the coming weeks, then you will find that it is no longer needing thesis and antithesis to develop it. Because first it was revealed through revelation, and then it respects the proper channels of knowing. What can be known using what means. Remember in the Munkit min ad-Dalal, Imam Al-Ghazali started by questioning all the faculties and the channels of knowing. He started by saying about how sometimes sense, experience can cheat you. And then sometimes even your rational capacity. Although, for example, certain rational means of knowing, such as mathematical reasoning, are usually indisputable. Like 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, even if somebody came with a stick and promises you that it can change into a snake. It doesn't change mathematical truths. But Imam Al-Ghazali said, but how do you know that you're not dreaming, for example? Yes, there are many times when you awoke from the dream, that in the dream, you felt that it was real, but then you woke up. So that means you see it was a fantasy, it wasn't real, like that. Kalau Descartes, he made it worse in the West. He said, what if you're being cheated by a demon? What if ada satu jin ini, he puts an illusion that actually everyone else ni is just a fiction of your imagination. Syaitan tu sihirkan kita, like that. How do you know that your memories were not invented in our times ni, macam the Matrix lah? How do you know that in reality you're stuck somewhere? Your electromagnetic waves ni is being harvested, supposing, for a company. How do you know? Maybe in fact in Singapore you're already being harvested, isn't it, for your energies? But according to Descartes, what was the principle that saved him? He said, well, if I'm doubting, he said, the fact that I'm doubting is a proof that I exist. And that's where he got this, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. If you're thinking, that means to say, subjective intuition is a proof that you exist. But subjective intuition, which is the foundation of modern thinking, cannot establish many other truths other than that. Yes? That's why they call it the Cartesian circle. In the end, you only know the existence of yourself and the existence of the external world. And very few things. But the ultimate questions, you still suffer tragic suffering. But Imam Al-Ghazali, what was the experience that made him more certain? It wasn't reason, it wasn't mathematical argument, it wasn't sense experience. He said it was through a light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shone upon him that gave him certainty. It is the light of Iman. So, likewise, that means to say in our worldview, once your conception of reality and truth is already crystal clear, and once you understand already that there is a path towards truth, now you're no longer confused about the limits of human knowing. Ultimately, that certainty and truth is at the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His absolute freedom. But you can prepare yourself to receive that. And that's what Imam Al-Ghazali did. He prepared himself to receive the light of Hidayah. Of course, ultimately, in the grand scale, Allah lah yang decide like that. But even then, there is some element of ikhtiyar on your part. You seek it until that certainty abides within you. Once it abides, and if your thinking is proper, then you don't have to fear what they can say about this thesis and antithesis and synthesis. There is already an ultimate synthesis. Why? Because for us it was historical. For them, thesis and antithesis with regards to socialism versus liberalism, and then turning again to communism and so on and so forth, identity politics. Why do they change from one state to another? Because they never had a perfect human being. That means to say there was never a final human being whose actions can be used as a role model. Tak pernah ada in their history. Not even Jesus. Because they didn't have records of sunnahs of Isa alayhi salam. And Nabi Allah Isa only lived until he was 30. Jadi, he cannot be used as a model for the old people in their times. He cannot be used as a role model for husbands. He cannot be used as a role model for fathers. And in fact, so few of the traditions survive about him, unlike what the Prophet Muhammad is, who was the perfect man. Jadi, with regards to social guidance, we already have a perfect man, unchanging. His sunnah was unchanged, unchanging, and unchangeable, like the Quran. Because the same people who narrated to us the Quran via the chain of tawatur were the very same people who also narrated the ahadith. And the literature, the body is enormous to details about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet Muhammad being the final messenger, the final guide to mankind. Jadi we don't suffer this thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We don't suffer their problems of the limits of religion, the limits of society and politics and so on and so forth. Because we have the Quran, which projects a vision which is unchanging. We have the Prophet Muhammad, whose sunnah is already settled. And we have also Islam in itself, which was completed during the lifetime of the Prophet and did not have to develop after his death. Unlike Christianity. Christianity was a religion that developed. Their way of praying, solat, segala macam itu, everything developed later. Even the name of the religion was not known. Yes, can you find Christianity in the Bible? Kenapa tak ada? Kalau it's supposed to be the religion sanctioned by God, why is the name of the religion not in the very source? In fact, the name Christians was given by their enemies, the Romans. These are followers of Christ, Jesus Christi, yes? But for us, we are not Muhammadans. We are Muslims. Because why? The name there, وَرَدِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا, in the Quran. And because they suffered, because they are Christians, they want to call us Muhammadans also. The Muslims are Muhammadans. Well, in reality, we are Muslims because the name, religion Islam tu, is already in the Quran. The way of praying, semua tu has been perfected in the time of the Prophet. So we don't suffer from this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And we only suffer that if we want to think like them. If we want to ask, what is the problem with capitalism, yeah? What is the problem with socialism, yeah? What is the way forward, like that? Whereas in reality, there is already a framework for economic thinking in Islam, a framework for justice in Islam, a framework for political thinking in Islam that allows for creative contributions, but yet there is an element of what we call dynamic stabilism. It is a stabilism in reality. Yes, ia adalah sebuah pergerakan yang teguh. Yang ni there is an element that is unchanging. But there is the dynamic element in so far as with regards to different social circumstances, the fiqh or the understanding grows based on the fundamental principles which are unchanging, like that. So we don't have this dualism like they have. So that's how we safeguard from the thesis and antithesis punya argument lah. So don't be too overawed by Karl Marx. Don't be too overawed by Hegel. Don't be too overawed by these people. In reality, why they develop all these explanations is because their original source of knowledge was later. Yeah? Jadi it's the same way. Why is it that the Shias, for example, why do they extend the quality of being ma'sum, yeah, meaning to say protected from sin, from the Prophet down right to the Imams, sampai Imam ke-12 ke, like that. Why do they continue like that? As according to Professor Wan, because they have denied the Sahabas. When you reject the Sahabas is it's not just a matter of Aqidah. Aqidah is of utmost importance, but more importantly, but as important is also epistemology. If you reject the major Sahabas, if you reject the major narrators of hadith, imagine just, katalah in the Sihah, yes, in the books, the Kutub As-Sittah, if you remove Sayyidatina Aisha's report, remove Sayyidina Abu Hurairah's report, remove Sayyidina Abu Bakar As-Siddiq's report, remove Sayyidina Umar's report, remove all the Sahabas that you disagree with, how many percent of the hadith literature will be surviving? Little, isn't it? Very little. And as a result of that, can you build an epistemology? That means, can you build a source of religion that will be descriptive of the entirety of the requirements of the human life? Just the removal of Sayyidatina Aisha, for example, will mean a lot of the part of the life of the Prophet Muhammad is unknown. If you remove Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, there are some hadiths which are not merely fiqhi in nature, but metaphysical in nature. If you remove Sayyidina Umar, if you remove Sayyidina Abu Bakr, there will be so many things which will be found wanting in the epistemic framework, in the framework of knowledge. Yes. So likewise in the West, that's what happened with their own. So because they lack true report of a messenger as a source of their ethics, as a source of their religion, so therefore they have to supply it using human rational system, imagination and experimentation. But look at the social ideologies. Yes, communism, liberalism. We have seen the catastrophes, isn't it? How was the First World War possible? It was first possible because of a change in their worldview. Yes. How did the nations come to fight each other to that extent? Why was the First World War possible? Because there was before that the War of the Nations. Why was there the War of the Nations? Because the nations split between the Protestants and the Catholics. Had they remained under the Holy Roman Empire, then the First World War would have been removed. There would not have been the First World War like that. And so on and so forth, changes in the worldview. This one will require another separate discussion on the development of Western culture and society and civilization like that. But yet, we suffer as a result of that, Kita pun terperangkap within this framework of nation states, framework of all these things are now inbuilt. You realize there are some permanent structures in your mind, or very solid structures in your mind that you cannot challenge, as if it's become solidified in your mind, isn't it? That's the new form of colonization. Yes. That's why I say again, gedangkan sin free. Let me say, first you need to liberate your minds from these structures, these false structures that has been in you. That allows you to only hone in, even with regards to religion, on a very specific aspect, individual aspect. In this aspect, you nak belajar 20 tahun agama pun tak apa, isn't it? But not the parts that will liberate you. Not the parts that will grant you certainty. Not the parts that will grant you freedom lah, ultimately. So, apologies if I said some sensitive things.